international trade negotiations. You would already be aware that trade negotiations are very complex, and therefore the topic is also reasonably complex. I welcome Jayant Das Gupta, who was India's ambassador to WTO, and he will be chairing today's session at a very short notice. I also welcome Professor Seema Batla from JNU. She's in the economics faculty. Of course, it is a school in JNU, and I also welcome other participants, also the participants who are joining online. Professor Abhijit Das Gupta needs Abhijit Das needs no introduction. He headed the Center for WTO Studies in Indian Institute of Foreign Trade for long years. Before joining the center, he was a civil servant, and not many civil servants become successful academics. So he is one of them who developed so much expertise in the issues relating to WTO negotiations that he is a highly respected and sought after figure, not only in India but also in other countries. And Professor Abhijit Das, I had once written an article when the lateral entry was being discussed, and I had said in that article that I welcome lateral entry, but the government will do well to identify the division which will be headed by those who are coming through lateral entry, rather than leaving it to the secretary to decide after joining where they want to post. So I had given this example of trade division in the agriculture ministry, and I had said that we do need someone through lateral entry for trade division, because the negotiations which are conducted at WTO are so complex and there is very little institutional memory in the ministries. So it is with some concern that I find that Center for WTO Studies and Indian Institute of Foreign Trade has let you move out. I'm sure that it is a loss for the center, but I also hope that your expertise will continue to be available to the Government of India, and whosoever is the ambassador in Geneva, Indian ambassador in Geneva in WTO, will make use of your long years of experience and academic rigor with which you have been writing on these issues. So I will take only a few more minutes. Last 2 decades have gone in discussing the agricultural trade negotiations in WTO, and still a final decision has not been taken, except on some minor issues which have been touted as great successes. For example, the public stockholding declaration at Bali is being touted as a great success. And not only that, even our great friends have been challenging India's stand in WTO on various issues. So whether it is Australia or US or Brazil, several of our issues, policies and practices have been challenged in WTO. We have been responding. In some cases, we have lost the cases, lost the WTO first level of hearing, for example, sugar, and we can expect much more questioning in future, because we are in breach of, at least in case of rice, we are in breach of the commitments which we have made. A few days back, some new papers have been discussed in WTO, and many new proposals have come. I think Professor Abhijit Das will be talking about that. This whole question of how the support is to be calculated is again being discussed. Before I formally invite Professor Abhijit Das, I would only like to say that the issues which are discussed in WTO are quite complex, and within the civil services, because of continuous transfer of officers at the joint secretary level, even director level, there is not much institutional memory. And therefore, we do need academic organizations which can support the government. And this center, which was established by Mr. Chandrasekhar, who later became cabinet secretary, has really played a very important role in enabling Indian negotiators in dealing with the very advanced and very well endowed teams of legal persons who are representing other countries. So I request Professor Abhijit Das to speak for about 35-40 minutes, and then we will have some 20-30 minutes of question answer. And my friend, uh, thank you, sir, for coming, Jayanto. He will also say something as chair of today's session. Thank you.
Thank you, sir, for a very generous introduction and a very warm welcome. At the outset, I'm extremely grateful to IIC and in particular Siraj Hussain, sir, for curating this lecture series on mapping sustainable agriculture and providing me this opportunity of sharing some thoughts on how the changing global dynamics in respect of issues related to sustainability and agriculture is posing and is likely to pose further challenges for India in international trade negotiations. Siraj sir had requested me that I must refrain from using jargons. I shall endeavor that, but let me also mention that when India was part of the negotiations in Uruguay round, the general impression in India about India's negotiating stance in Commerce Ministry was that India's negotiating stance is something like a mystery, which is surrounded by a secret, and the secret itself is encased in an enigma. So this is what was the situation in early 90s. But now I think we've moved much beyond that in terms of understanding, discussion, transparency. But having said that, some fundamental aspects in trade negotiations don't change. And as I will discuss today, many of those fundamental aspects continue to bedevil a large number of developing countries, including India. And the fact is that in terms of technical resources, be it economic, be it legal, the developed countries are miles ahead of us. And that is what really poses huge challenges for India as a developing country, trying to negotiate agreements which will have far reaching impact in different areas. Right, let's turn to sustainability and agriculture. Sustainability is really becoming the buzzword. We talk of sustainability in the context of manufacturing, we talk of sustainability in terms of agriculture. At times, we also talk of sustainability for tourism. Now, sustainability effectively is becoming the catchphrase, and in the context of trade negotiations, sustainability is also becoming, loosely speaking, a smokescreen for pushing a highly ambitious agenda, particularly of the developed countries. And that highly ambitious agenda really has mercantilism at its core. People may not be very enthused to hear it, but we cannot run away from that reality. And that reality gets so well manifested when we deliberate upon sustainability in the context of agriculture. Now, discussions on sustainable agriculture are being held in large number of intergovernmental organizations. These include UN itself, further within the aegis of UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, UNFCCC. Sustainability in agriculture context is also being deliberated upon at the FAO in Rome, at UNEP, at G20, at Indo-Pacific Economic Framework for prosperity at the WTO, etc. Now, the core objective of most of these deliberations is to transition to an agriculture system that meets the present and future generational needs without compromising on social, economic, and environmental dimensions. The discussions in various intergovernmental organizations are no doubt very useful. They have resulted in some instances in guidelines and recommendations for making agriculture sustainable. And in most of these intergovernmental organizations, the output so far has been in the form of declarations, agendas, agreed principles and targets. These are more for influencing national policies without imposing really binding obligations. To give just one example, even within the contours of the Paris Accord, countries had that nationally determined contribution for addressing climate change. That gives huge flexibility to countries to decide how to address issues around environment and climate change. But having said that, there are multiple indications that some of these non-binding outcomes at various intergovernmental organizations are slowly creeping into trade agreements in the form of binding rules, and these binding rules could also be subject to a dispute settlement mechanism, and these binding rules could be at the WTO. It could be in the multiple free trade agreements that are being negotiated. We already have evidence how in some of the existing free trade agreements of the developed countries, there are now binding obligations in respect of environment and agriculture. And some of these binding obligations, in a way, can be traced back to the deliberations which are being held or which were held in the past in a number of intergovernmental organizations. Thus, the short point which I want to make is, in order to understand the challenges which are likely to arise for India's trade negotiators in the context of agriculture and sustainability, we need to have a hard look at what is happening in this field in multiple intergovernmental organizations, try to second guess what type of commitments could countries be called upon to assume through trade agreements, and what could be the implications of some of these commitments. So, ladies and gentlemen, that is what my objective will be. But before proceeding to that objective, I just wanted to remind all of you that the UN SDG goal, rather UN SDG target 2.4, what it says is by 2030, and I quote here, ensure sustainable food production systems and implement resilient agricultural practices that increase productivity and production, that help maintain ecosystems, that strengthen capacity for adaptation to climate change, extreme weather, drought, flooding, and other disasters, and that progressively improve land and soil quality. Why I have mentioned SDG is for the very simple reason that many issues in various intergovernmental organizations are being pushed through under the veneer of trying to achieve a specific SDG. Just about a year ago, the WTO membership finalized an interim agreement on fisheries subsidies, which really was projected as being an outcome in furtherance of one of the SDGs. A very quick look at some of the concepts related to agriculture and sustainability. The FAO defines sustainability in multiple ways. One of the ways in which FAO talks of agriculture and sustainability is through the concept of food systems. What FAO articulates is food systems that encompass the entire range of actors and their interlinked value addition activities involving production, aggregation, processing, distribution, consumption, and disposal of food products that originate from agriculture, forestry, and fisheries. So, that is from the FAO perspective a fundamental one of the ways of looking at sustainable food systems. To take this further, at the FAO, sustainable food system is a concept where sustainability is to be examined holistically, not only from the perspective of agriculture production, but the entire range of activities around preceding agriculture production and succeeding agriculture production. Now, a sustainable food system, according to the FAO, is supposed to have three dimensions of sustainability: economic sustainability, social sustainability, and environmental sustainability. For a food system to be sustainable, or for agriculture to be sustainable, it must meet the needs of present and future generations while ensuring profitability, environmental health, social and economic equity. Why I'm spending some time in talking about these is each of these dimensions, based on the deliberations in the intergovernmental organizations, is likely to result in some very far-reaching obligations which will be sought to be pushed at the WTO or through free trade agreements. Let's look at what UNEP talks of when it discusses environmental sustainability. According to UNEP, an environmentally sustainable or resource smart food system is a food system in which the environmental basis to deliver food security for future generations is not compromised, and it lays down three principles: sustainable use of renewable resources, efficient use of all resources, low environmental impacts from food system activities. We can look into the deliberations of G20. We will come across similar concepts. I will not elaborate further in that direction. A quick look at what does WTO have to say about sustainability, sustainable agriculture, sustainable food systems. Now, in the context of agriculture, environment, and sustainable development, these have been mentioned at a few places in the WTO agreements. For example, the Marrakesh Agreement, which is the foundational agreement of the WTO, the preamble, and I quote over here the preamble, that relevant part, it says, allowing for the optimal use of the world's resources in accordance with the objective of sustainable development. So that provides a small window for pushing issues around sustainable development at the WTO. Coming specifically to agriculture, the preamble of Agreement on Agriculture notes, and I quote over here, that commitments under the reform program should be made in an equitable way among all members, having regard to non-trade concerns, including food security and the need to protect the environment. The message which we derive from the existing legal provision at the WTO is very simple. The environment window is not very wide, but for various reasons, this environmental window has over the past 24-25 years has become widened. And if we look at the outcome of the last ministerial meeting held in Geneva in 2022, sustainable food systems for the first time entered the WTO lexicon. And we have two outcome documents. One is the Food Insecurity Declaration, which came out in 2022. The preamble of the Food Insecurity Declaration mentions promoting sustainable agriculture and food systems. Another ministerial declaration, which was on responding to modern challenges in the area of what are called sanitary and phytosanitary measures. There, the members agreed to explore how implementation and application of this SPS agreement can support facilitating global food security and more sustainable food systems. The message over here is very clear. Based on the outcomes of last year's ministerial conference, sustainable food systems have got a toehold in the WTO negotiating agenda. And the apprehension is that this toehold can really become a very big opening for the developed countries to push what they have been discussing at other intergovernmental organizations as a legally binding, legally enforceable provision at the WTO. And now, what could be some of the obligations that might emerge in this area? I will try to keep it relatively simple, straightforward. At the WTO already, we have a detailed submission of the United States made in March this year, which says that in order to promote food security, members should not unnecessarily restrict the flow of food and have policies in place to facilitate trade at the border. It sounds very innocuous, but if we dig a bit deeper, what this would really entail is countries like India, which at this juncture have the right to impose export taxes on food products, they would lose this right. Countries like India may, if they impose export prohibitions or restrictions, they may have to justify why such export prohibitions or restrictions are necessary. And at the WTO, the experience is that very few countries who invoke an exception have succeeded in showing that they have passed the necessity test. So the short point here is that what might emerge at the WTO itself is a set of obligations that would prevent countries like India from preventing export of food stock in cases when there is a global food crisis, when there is a shortage of food globally, when global food prices rise, and that could in some manner undermine our own food security. And let's bear in mind that this proposal by the United States is aimed at meeting food security. Ironies abound at the WTO. Then there could also be some obligations around regulatory cooperation for addressing barriers which arise from delays in import inspection, certification, labeling, approval of novel food products, etc., that could have positive fallouts. One could be optimistic on that. Then another line of argument which the United States has made is that food security can be enhanced by encouraging scientifically sound regulatory systems and open markets, promote adoption of new technologies and approaches, and this is where the killer punch is, facilitate the trade of products produced with new methods. Now, all this again sounds very innocuous, but if you go into the background of what these words mean, Products produced with new methods is nothing but a coded form of saying genetically modified food, genetically engineered seeds. Now, if a trade negotiator is not aware of what these words have signified in other intergovernmental organizations, he might just bite the bait and think, well, this is harmless. What's wrong in agreeing to it? Now, if what US has proposed in this area is agreed to, then countries would find it extremely difficult to restrict imports of GM food and genetically engineered seeds, and they can do it only if sufficient scientific evidence exists. Next, marketing approvals for GM food and GM seeds would need to be granted within a specified time period. In other words, the cautious, calibrated approach which India has adopted in giving marketing approvals for GM food and genetically engineered seeds, that cautious approach maybe we will have to abandon. It is also likely that since the discussion, the obligation is around genetically engineered seeds, countries might be required to join what is called the International Convention for the Protection of New Plant Varieties, UPOV 1991, which would really give or put at a higher pedestal the rights of seed breeders, and the right of farmers would really be at a lower level. So this is yet another area where some obligations can emerge. A third line of argument of the United States for promoting food security is that as new technologies and innovative approaches are necessary for farmers to overcome challenges they face in order to achieve sustainable productivity growth, it's important to allow new technologies to come in. And what could be the new technologies? Agri-tech. So behind this push of US, which sees use of new technology as the magic bullet for solving food security, the game is very clear. Countries should not restrict agri-tech firms from coming into their countries. Now, I'm not against technology. Technology certainly can be harnessed for the good. But when it comes to agriculture, if we allow agri-tech not India-based agri-tech, but let's say agri-tech companies based in US or some other countries, then certain aspects of our agriculture systems, we will become completely import dependent. For example, precision agriculture through use of weather data or geospatial data, or use of IoTs and sensors to improve productivity, or post-harvest handling, quality check analysis, etc. Now, I'm not saying that in small farms this will happen. This will not happen in small farms, but in larger farms, there is a possibility that agri-tech firms will be performing important agriculture-related services. No harm in that, provided the agri-tech firms are homegrown. If we allow foreign-based agri-tech firms an entry into our country, the possibility of homegrown agri-tech firms to even get a foothold is completely ruled out. The reality of the digital arena is very clear. The first commercially successful entity, their advantage gets almost frozen in time, and you will never have a domestically grown agri-tech firm which can deliver agriculture related services, and that will make us substantially import dependent on agri-tech services. The final aspect of the US proposal on food security is to encourage policies that support sustainable agriculture practices while discouraging policies that result in overproduction, overuse, etc. Now, this can have the following implications. First and foremost, new rules might be negotiated that will allow countries to give subsidies to GM product, GM seed without any monetary ceiling. At the same time, restrictions could be imposed on subsidies which supposedly result in environmental damage through encouraging overproduction, overuse, misallocation of resources. And over here, I will have to perforce delve a bit into one technicality. Under the Agreement on Agriculture, India, along with other developing countries, has a special flexibility available to it. And that flexibility is that developing countries can give unlimited amount of input subsidies. In other words, subsidies for fertilizer, irrigation, seeds, electricity. Our hands are not tied. We can give unlimited amount of these subsidies. But this flexibility is what the US is targeting. Under the garb that these subsidies are leading to overproduction, certainly a very concerted attempt will be made to see that this flexibility is eroded. And the country which will get most badly affected is India. We are the largest users of this subsidy, literally by far the largest user. The second user would be about 8 or 9 times lower than India. So we are really on the radar screen of the United States when it says that these subsidies which could result in overproduction needs to be disciplined. A quick look at what is happening at UNEP. UNEP again has come out with a recommendation which says that removal of subsidies that encourage unsustainable production or practices. Again, the target is the same set of subsidies on inputs which I mentioned earlier. Then the United Nations has a UN Food Systems Summit, and the action points which emerge from those summit are very interesting. One of the action points is reduce food losses. Again, very benign, but dig deeper, and what it might entail is countries having to give a mandatory commitment to open up services related to warehousing, distribution, and retail. The UN Food Systems Summit further exhorts countries to promote decent work for all actors along the food chain. Decent work can be actually decoded as maybe prescribing a minimum wage or enforcing certain standards for working of farmers and all those involved in the entire agriculture food chain. Now, this sounds good, right? We'll be working for improving the conditions in which farmers work. But how many people can afford it in the rural areas? Will this not become really an instrument for shutting down some of the small farms? That is the apprehension. Then UN Food Systems Summit also recommends building consumer demand for sustainably produced food. Now, this is likely to permit product discrimination based on carbon emissions related to how the food was produced. Quick look at what FAO has been recommending or what FAO has been talking about. I mentioned that under the FAO's perspective on sustainable food systems, there are 3 dimensions: economic, social, and environmental. Under the economic dimension, what the FAO suggests is that activities conducted by each actor in the food system must be commercially viable, fiscally viable. What could be the implications of this for our minimum support price scheme? Is it profitable for each actor? Is it fiscally viable? Is it commercially profitable? Very big question. FAO further says the activities conducted by food system actors should generate taxes for governments. Will this compel developing countries, including India, to impose income tax on farmers? Agriculture income tax? Turning to the social dimension, what FAO says is food system activities need to contribute to the advancement of important outcomes such as labor conditions and animal welfare. Again, the apprehension is that commitments on minimum wages, working conditions for farm labor would not only increase prices, but could be used as a non-tariff barrier for restricting our exports to other countries. Commitments on conditions in which cattle and poultry are reared and slaughtered could really be a very effective non-tariff barrier by the developed countries. When it comes to the environmental dimension, what the FAO says is that the impact of food system activities on surrounding natural environment should be neutral or positive. Translated into specific obligations, it could make access to subsidies conditional on impacts of food system activities on surrounding natural environment. Further, an agricultural product could be allowed to be put on the market only if all activities related to it were neutral or had a positive impact on the environment. Now, this will apply equally to imported product as well as domestically produced products. So, if this type of an obligation through the trade agreement enters the rule book, then even our domestic agricultural producers might find it difficult to sell in the Indian market. A quick look at COP26. At COP26, there was a methane pledge which required countries to target a 30% reduction in global methane emissions by 2030 over the 2020 levels. Luckily, India did not join the methane pledge. That was for the very simple reason that our Department of Agriculture had complete clarity that agreeing to the methane pledge would have severe adverse consequences, not only for our agriculture, but also for cattle rearing, etc. So that was a good illustration of effective coordination between two different arms of the government, which prevented an outcome which could have been problematic for us. Now, some of the commitments which I have talked of earlier, many of these are contained in European Union's proposal to India in the FTA negotiations. So what is happening at FAO, what is happening at UNEP, or some of what is happening at UN, many of those are now part of European Union's proposal to India. The point to note is that what European Union has proposed is at this juncture not a hard law. It is more in the nature of soft law. But this soft law can itself become a hard law through a system of monitoring and surveillance which the European Union has proposed. A very quick look at how sustainability is being used as a mercantilist tool, particularly by the European Union. Some of you have heard of the carbon border tax, CBAM as it's called. Logic being that, well, my producers pay a carbon tax. If an imported product embodies high amount of carbon emission, in order to create a level playing field, the imported product should also pay a carbon border tax. We have experts here who have done a lot of work in carbon border tax, so I hesitate a bit to delve further into it. But the short point is carbon border tax was supposed to be a measure for countering carbon emissions. The reality is that carbon border tax of European Union will reduce global carbon emissions not even by 1%, by just 0.5%. That is just an example to show how environmental measures aimed at protecting environment, are really aimed at protecting the domestic producers. A very good illustration of this in the agriculture sector is EU regulation in the pipeline, which is called deforestation regulation. After having chopped off its primary forests, almost 90% of its primary forests, European Union has now woken up and says, oh, it's a big tragedy that for economic activities, forests have to be chopped. So what we will do is, in respect of products such as cattle, cocoa, coffee, oil palm, rubber, soya, and wood, if any of these products have to be sold in the European Union market, they must be accompanied with what EU says a deforestation-free certificate, which really says that no forests were cut after 31st December 2020 as part of production or other downstream activities related to that product. Now, effectively, for a developing country like India, it's very complex, cumbersome to give a deforestation-free certificate. Not because we are chopping forests. No, even if we are not chopping forests, the legal requirements which are there to come out with such a certificate is so onerous that it's very difficult to see Indian exporters complying with it. Effectively, this deforestation regulation will make sure that most of the developing countries are unable to export agricultural products. At this juncture, these 7, the list can get expanded tomorrow to the European Union, and European Union can thereafter try to artificially enhance the financial muscle of its farmers. So in conclusion, what I would like to highlight is many of the recommendations which have been contained in the deliberations on sustainable agriculture in various intergovernmental organizations are useful, provided these are not made legally binding, not made legally enforceable, so that a country like India can choose how much to do, what to do, over what time frame, where to do, in order to implement these recommendations and make it consistent with our own domestic needs and constraints. But problem really arises if these non-binding guidelines, etc., enter into trade agreements as binding provisions, legally enforceable through dispute settlement mechanism. So those who are responsible for negotiating outcomes at FAO, UN, G20, UNEP, etc., must be sensitized about the likely implications if these outcomes become a basis for negotiating binding rules at the WTO. And at the same time, our trade negotiators also need to coordinate and work closely with Agriculture Ministry, Environment Ministry to make sure that the country does not make commitments in trade agreements which it might not have agreed in the context of discussions, negotiations at environment-related forum. Now, no discussion on agriculture can end without a talk on subsidies. All of you would be aware how farm subsidies are very high in the developed countries. Now, an attempt is being made at the WTO to cut farm subsidies through a particular formula. I'll not go into the formula, but the result of that formula will be that let's say, if that formula gets implemented, 5 years down the line, the flexibility which a country like India has at this juncture to support its farmers, that flexibility is about 20% of value of production of agriculture. That will come down to about 3 to 4%. Whereas the loss of flexibility for developed countries will not be substantial at all. And underlying this formula is the concern on sustainable agriculture. So, with those few words, Chairman Sir, I will conclude my remarks. I hope these were along the lines of what you might have had in your mind, and I do hope that all of you would have found it interesting. Thanks a lot for your very kind attention, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you, Abhijit, for a marvelous presentation, because many of the facts I was not myself aware of, especially relating to the recent developments in intergovernmental organizations spanning from the FAO, UNEP to UN agencies and other related agencies. And the possibility that these informal understandings or formal understandings without a binding commitment could find their way into the WTO, because I must explain to many of the attendees here that when a country takes an obligation in the FAO, if the country does not fulfill its obligation, nothing can be done against it. If a country fails to fulfill its obligation at the WTO, which is in the form of a binding obligation, then the country can be taken to the dispute settlement panel, to the appellate body after that, and could be compelled to fulfill its obligations, failing which there could be compensation which could be levied on the country by the affected countries whose interests have been hurt. And there could be retaliatory action across sectors. For instance, you do something in agriculture which is goods. So a country which is affected and wins in the WTO can take action against India in services, in intellectual property, or in some other area. This is why there is this tendency to bring in agreements under the umbrella of the WTO. There is a very well developed wing of the FAO which deals with fisheries. But fisheries subsidies, in order to bite, will need to have the protection of the WTO dispute settlement system. Only then it would be a binding obligation. That is why this concern for the environment, and if I may say so, Abhijit has given many examples of how things are creeping into the public discourse, then into the WTO. For instance, sustainable agriculture has now found its way into two of the texts which were negotiated in June 2022, last year in the ministerial conference in WTO. Environment and trade, and the other issue about trade and labor standards, these were something which were raised chiefly by the European Union, which again has taken the lead in many of these initiatives way back in Singapore in 1996 in the ministerial conference, first ministerial conference of the WTO. And it was opposed tooth and nail by India and other developing countries, because we could perceive even at that time that it was going to, in some way or the other, be used as a non-tariff barrier to restrict our exports, to restrict our export opportunities and our growth, and to provide a kind of an open goal to the other side. That is why we did not allow trade and environment to come into the WTO fold for negotiations, and trade and labor standards also. I will end by saying this, that in the WTO, the developed countries, as Abhijit has also alluded to, they don't give up easily. If they meet with resistance and failure now, they'll raise it in, and they are very creative, in some other form 5 years down the road, 10 years down the road. Their interests are permanent, and those interests have been very carefully calculated as to how they can be met and served. So they are not going to give up. The challenge before the developing countries is to maintain their march towards upliftment of millions from poverty, from a low standard of living, in a sustainable way. Now, the basic theme of the environmental activists and the aficionados is that it should be dealt with at different fora. That is where India differs. You take a commitment in the UNFCCC about carbon emissions, we will abide by it. And we have in fact also informally agreed that we will advance our target from 2070 to as close to 2050 as possible. It may not be possible because of other reasons, but that is something which we are very deeply wedded to, because we know that we all share a common fate and we all must contribute. But to restrict us, and the problem with India, which is now the most populous nation on earth, is about feeding its people, which is related to providing sustainable livelihoods to approximately 45 to 48% of the people who are involved primarily in agriculture. But if you take other associated occupations, it goes up to around 55%. So if we restrict our production, if we keep different kinds of artificial dampeners on the livelihoods of our people, there would be, it is not sustainable. There would be tumult, there would be civil unrest, there would be other consequences. So we have to look at sustainability in all its aspects, not only from the point of view of the environment, which the government of India is prepared to do, but from the social and economic aspects as well, which is the point which Abhijit has been stressing time and time again. So I'll not take any further time. May I now throw open the floor for discussions, observations, questions on the very rich presentation that Abhijit has just placed before us. Yes, please.
Hi.
Identify yourself and yes.
My name is Ishrat Kadok. I'm an economist with the FAO based in Rome, and I am here not representing FAO because I'm on study leave pursuing my PhD, so I will not be speaking on behalf of them. My sort of big picture question, actually before that, Chair, if you will allow, congratulations, I think, to the center. I think you're doing an excellent job. Among the developing countries, it's one of the leading centers in terms of the analysis that comes out, and it informs, a lot of policy. So it's really excellent work, and your presentation obviously is excellent as well. One big picture question, I suppose, that I have is, what is your proposal in terms of sustainability? So if we leave aside, let's say, the diplomatic issues and sort of diplomacy in terms of internationally, if we leave aside politics domestically, if you really think about sustainability from an objective point of view, some of the leading agricultural economists in this country argue against subsidies, argue for more investments in research and development. And export restrictions, you spoke about that. We know that the 2007-2008 food price crisis was in part caused by export restrictions that were sort of anticipated rather than real sort of shortages in food supplies. So how do you see those issues? What is a policy recommendation, let's say, that you would have for India itself in terms of improving sustainability in agriculture? My second question, if you will allow, sir, is I think a large part of what you were talking about was how the international organizations are influencing WTO texts potentially, or trade texts, and I would say even vice versa. We know some SDGs are informed by sort of WTO language itself. Where do you see the role for capacity building especially of trade negotiators, but also sort of ambassadorial staff that are sitting in Rome and in sort of other capitals? Because we see the US being extremely strong, the EU teams being extremely strong in terms of their communication, whereas that is not the case for developing countries. And I would say particularly the import competing countries, it's not the case. The exporters are still very, very, very coordinated. So where do you see capacity gaps, and where do you see the role of India as a leader among G33 countries on that? Thank you.
Seema, let's see.
Okay, Seema.
Please go ahead.
Thank you, and wonderful presentation. You have given so much food for thought. I can see that there's big question of political economy. The developed countries are wanting to sell their technologies, even if they have so much emissions. They are the culprit in releasing so many emissions, but now they are after the developing countries that you guys are emitting a lot, right? So we cannot give way to, and we have to fight for it. So my bigger question to you is that like we did a study together, Siraj sir and I, and we found that subsidies may be under radar, right? But the analysis shows that subsidies are a short-term incentive for farmers to carry on their production structures, right? So now if we do not give subsidy on fertilizer, we do not give subsidy on power, the likely estimate is that the food grain production is going to come down by 8 to 10%. So what is the way out? The way out is we go in for cash transfer, as has been going on in the official circles. But even if we give DBT, direct benefit transfer, the amount of subsidy that is given by India is very large, given the fact that we are a very big country, right? And on top of it, this issue of MSP is there, which is again false narratives have been created at the Europe and among the European countries that India is giving a lot of MSP subsidy through output subsidy through MSP. So what is your take on this? Should we continue with this fight? Because we cannot, our small and marginal farmers, which are 86%, we cannot do without subsidy. Even if we as economists we say okay, subsidy is a short-term measure, long-term measure is investment, but in the short run the small and marginal farmers, especially in the eastern belt, they need hand-holding by the government. So what should be the take of India and other developing countries, given the fact that our domestic issues are very, difficult?
Thanks a lot to both of you for your very, very thought-provoking questions. On the big picture of how should we look at sustainability in the international context, I think any discussion on sustainability which results in rule-making has to recognize justice, it has to recognize equity, it has to recognize who were responsible for the problem in the first place. And the EU deforestation is a prime example. After chopping off 80 to 90% of the forests, of its primary forests, now the onus is being shifted onto the shoulders of developing countries to preserve primary forests. So I think a fundamental, any solution around sustainable agriculture has to necessarily recognize the historical legacy and how that has created the present problem. And that has to inform future rule making in this area. And the future rule making in the area has to be based on common but differentiated responsibility, something which almost has gone out of the window through the Paris Accord. It is there, but in a very, very limited manner. You mentioned about export restrictions. Ambassador Dasgupta was there in Geneva when this G20 meeting was held, summit meeting, where at the level of leaders, there was an agreement to do away with export restrictions in food. Yes. And China fought, saying that, well, a large country like China with the highest population, our first commitment is to our own people. I think that reality has to prevail when we talk of the Indian situation. Yes, export restrictions do distort the market, but think of situation when there is no export restriction, global prices are high, global demand is high, supply is insufficient, and India is not able to put export restrictions on rice. What will happen? 2 or 3 things. Our traders are going to make a killing by exporting rice. There will be domestic shortages. Rice is a very thinly traded global commodity. Global prices will, despite India exporting, will go through the roof. We will have to import rice at a much higher price, and the net food importing countries who depend on rice, they will be deprived of rice. Let's be very clear on it. So, very fact that India has the flexibility at this juncture to impose export restrictions, it is able to meet its own food security requirements, number one. And number two, since it does not have to go into the global market for purchase, it helps stabilize prices. That's one aspect which we end up ignoring. So that is something which we need to bear in our mind, that by imposing export restrictions on foodstuff, India tries to meet its own domestic demand. It does not have to go to the global market. If it were to go to the global market, that would exacerbate the problem further. On issue of subsidies, I'm completely with you that we need to reform our subsidy schemes. I have no doubt about it. Our input subsidies on irrigation, fertilizer, power, etc., we need to do a hard think on what is the way forward. There is no option. There has to be a rationalization, restructuring, reworking, but that has to be done keeping our own domestic constraints, imperatives, requirements in mind. If we are compelled to do it on account of any commitment which we take in a trade agreement, then the outcome may be disruptive for us. So that is my response to you on the subsidies question. Professor Seema Batla, on capacity building in trade for negotiators at Rome. Do you know what is the size of our mission which services FAO?
Not more than 1-2 people? No, it's small.
It's one. It's one. There is a representative from Agriculture Ministry who goes, and in normal circumstances,
He's the ambassador to the FAO.
To the FAO. So, in normal circumstances, that representative might be knowing agriculture inside out, but doesn't have much to do with trade. So there was a time, sometime in 2014, when Commerce Ministry worked very closely with FAO representative, because it was a crunch time for us on public stockholding issue. But that unfortunately doesn't happen all the time. So if capacity building has to be done of negotiators, it has to start with the representative at FAO. And that is the weak link, more so now in the sustainability context, when outcomes at FAO will very likely creep into the WTO as binding rules. So the representatives of FAO have to be mindful of this reality. Seema, on your question, I fully agree with you that for small farmers, we cannot do away with subsidies. And DBT ameliorates the problem, but only partially. But it is a way forward. But at the same time, if the government doesn't engage in procurement through MSP, the viability of the small farmers may be in question. So whether we like it or not, for small farmers at least the subsidies will have to continue. And I do recall your very detailed research on how it's better to put the money in investment in agriculture, research or infrastructure. That helps, certainly, but there has to be a trade-off. And at this juncture, I think the trade-off is to bend in favor of subsidies for small farmers.
Yes, please come.
Yeah, no, I wanted to come on the larger picture, and thank you very much for a very informative set of data and information, and also a kind of a wake-up call for all those involved in the agriculture sector in India and internationally. My comment, not exactly a question and with a request, relates more to the larger issue of the dilemma you presented in the beginning about certain intergovernmental organizations creating norms which are not binding as against certain others which are creating norms that are binding. In international law, actually international agreements are all have a certain status. The term binding is being used only in terms, is being used by the lawyers more to point to the possibility of a threat of sanctions or retaliations. If you are getting into a treaty, whether it is a UN treaty or a WTO treaty, it's all binding. So if we are agreeing to any norms in FAO or UNEP or elsewhere, it doesn't mean that we do not have to meet those norms. We don't have to meet those obligations. Yes, we have a threat of retaliation, currently not really active because of the appellate body not functioning in the WTO, and we don't have the same kind of retaliation except in Chapter 11 of UN Charter anywhere else in intergovernmental organization. So now, how do you create rules, whether binding or not binding in the terminology that you use, which create an international law which is acceptable to all and therefore becomes just cogence? So one has to look at it from that point of view and not allow norm setting to reach a just cogence level without the concerns of all developing countries, without concerns of India, and without concerns of those that are participating in that conversation being addressed. How do you do that? The way you do that is to, for example, in UNFCCC you mentioned CBDR, and I think the RC is the respective capability is even more important than the CBDR. I agree partly with you that after Paris Agreement, CBDR is not as important as it was. But then the writing was on the wall that Kyoto Protocol has failed. So something had to be done, and India was in a leadership role in Paris Agreement, and it had to take a stance that could bring out an agreement rather than an abject failure of the COP. So, which is actually a norm making, moving forward of the international thinking on environment, on climate change, resulting in certain norms which are acceptable to all, like it is INDCs, it is not commitments. Can you take your argument on agriculture sustainability further towards what would be an acceptable just cogence for a country like India? Because India is a sui generis, largest population, a poor country, yet a huge aspirational population that is wanting to be in leadership roles everywhere in the world, having the capacity and the capability to become a developed country, maybe very soon. So keeping that in mind, keeping the leadership role in mind, keeping the fact that we constitute the critical mass that creates the just cogence, can you take this argument forward and reach that situation? Thank you.
You wanted to raise a question?
Yeah. Before your replies, can I ask? Okay. I am Professor Afrozul Haq, Professor of Food Technology, and currently working as Vice Chancellor of a university in Manipur. Professor Abhijit, very interesting lecture and informative. It is a question, or I don't know, the sustainable agriculture and sustainable food should be in line with the sustainable healthy life. Because during the last 50 years, essential minerals are depleting from the food that we are producing. For example, magnesium. The levels of magnesium depleted by 50% during the last 50 years. So now, I would like to suggest that there should be a space for fortification of minerals and vitamins as well. Two weeks back, I was in a meeting as a consultant by WHO in Beirut and for the East Mediterranean region. And now WHO has mandatory fortification of flour and bread with vitamin D. There are two main problems for WHO now: the vitamin D deficiency and the anemia in the women in the Eastern Mediterranean region. So, Professor Abhijit, I would like to have your comments, please.
Maybe I'll start with your question, sir. In fact, no, I agree with you that sustainable agriculture has to be in some manner equated with a healthy life. In fact, I purposely did not go into this aspect of nutrient depletion, etc., because that itself is a separate stream with many obligations which can come in trade agreements. So I thought it would be too complex a topic to discuss today. But I fully agree with you that there has to be a space for fortification of micronutrients. There's absolutely no denying that. And coming to the earlier question, I have to get a bit personal over here. Mr. Atul Kaushik was someone who, through his charter, not through his submission, he used to be an Indian negotiator once upon a time. He posed about 25 questions to European Union, which managed to push back EU's environment agenda for 2-3 years. So Atul's questions, in a nutshell, are very, very difficult to answer. Even European Union took, with their battery of lawyers and economists, it took them 3 years to get back. So Atul, I'm nowhere in a position to give you a convincing response. But what we need to bear in mind is that the norms which countries, particularly developing countries, agree to in IOs, some of them are aspirational. And why they take on aspirational norms is because they have the assurance that if they are unable to meet those aspirational norms, they'll not be hauled up through a retaliation. But then the problem is, if those aspirational norms then get transplanted into trade agreements where you have a binding enforcement mechanism, then certainly there's a problem. And what could be a set of norms for a country like India, which can meet its requirements under sustainability as well as its leadership role? Very difficult to pinpoint, but some broad principles could be adhered to. First thing, of course, as I mentioned, is we need to go back to where the problem arose in the first place, who were responsible for it. We cannot run away from it. We've tried, we may not have succeeded, but we need to persist along those lines. Second is, we have to demonstrate ourselves through our domestic actions that we are serious about sustainability and in agriculture. Now that will enhance our stature, credibility at the negotiating table. And given that background, certainly we can secure more effective CBDR and through CBDR and RC, something which can work better for the country. Now, I know this is a very, not even a flimsy, it's flimsiest of the flimsy responses, but at this juncture, that is the best I can do.
So thanks a lot, Professor Abhijit Das and other friends, Mr. Atul Kaushik, Professor Seema Batla, my friend Dr. Jayanta Das Gupta, and my very old friend Dr. Afroz. And also, thank you very much for coming from FAO. Now, in conclusion, I must share with you something about which I keep thinking all the time. Going forward, next 10, 15, 20 years, will we become a large exporter of agricultural produce, or we will be producing just about enough to meet our own requirement? An atmosphere was created in the last few years for a variety of reasons, as if we have very large surpluses. But those of us who understand Indian agriculture knew that our surpluses are very marginal. And the last 2 years events have shown that one after the other we have had to impose ban. I do not think, madam, there was an option before the government. So despite all this, conceptual arguments advanced by economists that bans distort trade and this, that, and the other, I think no government could have afforded not to put restrictions in the interest of food security of Indians. So I think we call it a day here. Thank you, Jayantu, and thanks a lot, Professor. And I would also like to thank friends who have joined online. I hope you found the talk very interesting and very full of facts and data. And now I think those of us in this room and also those who have joined online, realize how important it is for the government to take help of professionals who spend years researching these aspects of trade, because two of us are from the civil services. We know that our joint secretaries keep coming and going, and therefore we cannot expect them to have long institutional memory. So we will do well to further strengthen Center for WTO Studies, and I keep wondering whether even a fraction of the budget we have for G20 can be given for research to organizations like WTO. Thank you very much. Can you please sign the register so that this series of lectures can continue?